the Ukrainians are well into the second line of defences. And as the commander of that southern front has discussed in the last 48 hours, it appears the Russians had the majority of their troops, about 60%, in that first line, with much smaller troop deployments in the second and third line. So we could see some pretty significant developments in the coming weeks.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we're talking to a retired general of the Australian Army with more than 30 years experience. Major General Mick Ryan has commanded units from platoon to brigade level. In January 2018, he assumed command of the Australian Defence College in Canberra and is now adjunct fellow at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, DC. His book, War Transformed, was published in 2022 by US Naval Institute Books. Mick, great to speak to you. Welcome to Frontline. You've just written How Ukraine Can Win a Long War for the publication Foreign Affairs. It's kind of a blunt stock taking, really, of the war some 18 months on. How do you see it?
Okay, it's great to speak with you. Well, after 18 months, I think Ukraine is probably in a better position now than it was this time last year. That doesn't mean things are going great, but the ongoing offensive in the south is making slow progress. I expect that we'll probably see some more in the coming weeks. But as I did in that article, I think we need to see it in the context of a whole range of other things the Ukrainians are doing. The southern campaign is one of many ground, air and maritime campaigns it's undertaking concurrently. And it's making small progress or even large progress in most of these campaigns. So we need to see it through the context of all of them, not just the southern one.
And yet you warn against the Western desire for instant gratification in the counteroffensive. But Yuri Sak, an advisor to Ukraine's defense minister, says Russian lines have been breached after the Robotyne offensive. Is your opinion at all swayed by that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's very compelling, the evidence that is starting to come in. I mean, obviously, operational security means we're always a little bit behind, but the Ukrainians are well into the second line of defences. And as the commander of that southern front has discussed in the last 48 hours, it appears the Russians had the majority of their troops, about 60%, in that first line, with much smaller troop deployments in the second and third line. So we could see some pretty significant developments in the coming weeks.
It's hard to really understand what progress has been made when you're looking at Ukraine from the outside, and even sometimes the people on the ground who are fighting on the front line in the counteroffensive don't know what's happening elsewhere along that hugely long line. How do you assess the progress from the outside?
Well, one of the things I did well before this offensive started was sat down and thought, well, how would you measure success in this? And I came up with a few measures. I've been using them ever since. One of them is obviously taking back territory, liberating Ukrainian territory. But also another measure is how many Russian units you destroy or make non-effective by the end of this. And the Ukrainians have been doing a lot of that. Another measure might be how well placed are they at the end of this to place Crimea at risk or to undertake operations. And I think the final one is how successful do Ukraine supporters think the offensive has been? I think there is a shift in that kind of view over the last few days after some fairly negative reporting out of Washington, DC. But you've got to take all these measures of success together and measure them consistently throughout the offensive.
And if you apply those measures now, what is your conclusion?
If I applied them right now, I'd say the Ukrainians have the initiative. They certainly have momentum in the east and in the south. They certainly have accelerated their momentum in the strategic strikes against Russian targets, which are having a military impact as well as a political impact. So, I think the Ukrainians certainly have the strategic initiative and they're better placed now than they were a year ago.
Just over 2 months into the counteroffensive, what has Ukraine learnt about what it needs and what it needs to do to break through Russian defences?
Well, I think it's learnt that the combined arms warfare that many in the West, including the Americans, thought they should use isn't quite fit for what they are facing against the Russians. Many of the tactics and technologies that Western armies use are decades old and haven't been tested at least since the 1991 Gulf War. Since that time, we've seen a meshing of military and civil sensors, which makes the battlefield far more transparent. And with new digital command and control systems, it makes the ability to see things and then bring them under fire much, much quicker than we were ever used to in the past. So I think the Ukrainians are doing a lot of learning, they're doing a lot of adapting, and there's a lot of learning that we can all do from them.
And how have they adapted? What have you spotted?
Well, there's been a few different things. Firstly, they've been operating in a far more dispersed way. Part of this is they haven't really worked at, division or corps level before, but also they've learnt that if you concentrate too many soldiers, too many tanks in one place, the Russians see them and attack them with a lot of artillery and rockets. But if they disperse more, they can decrease the impact of the Russian kill chain, if we'd like to call it that. Another one is that going through these minefields, they've also found that a lot of Western tactics and techniques are well out of date. They've had to do it in a more dismounted way rather than with mechanised equipment like Western armies would prefer. And it's worked for them, but it's been very slow and they've taken a lot of casualties for that. So, they've learned a lot in this process, and I think there's a lot that we can all observe and learn from them.
And on those challenges of getting through the minefields, the West, you say, should have anticipated those kind of challenges. What should they have done? What should they have provided?
Well, we saw the Russians building these defensive works in the south from late last year. So we knew this was going on. We knew there would be mines in there. But we've also, at the same time, been watching these developments in autonomous systems that both sides are using to drastically decrease the time between when you're detected and when you can be destroyed. But we thought the same old tactics and the same old technologies would work in that environment. I think we were wrong. I think this is an intellectual failure on the part of the West, and I think we've got a lot of catching up to do.
In August, Ukraine entered a joint manufacturing agreement with Sweden for the CV90 infantry fighting vehicle. With their shortage of mine-clearing vehicles, could this be their next target for domestic production?
Well, I think it's a great development that they've done that. That's a superb infantry fighting vehicle, one of the best, if not the best, in the world. I think they've also got an arrangement to build Leopard 2 main battle tanks as well. So, they've sorted out their heavy armour, and these will come with a variety of different vehicles, not just to carry infantry, but for command and control, for electronic warfare, and potentially engineer and mine clearance vehicles. But I think the real future lays in autonomous systems being used to both detect minefields, to map them out in detail, and then to use autonomous ground vehicles to clear them. I mean, if you lose 10 or 100 autonomous ground vehicles doing this, you're not writing any letters home to families who have lost soldiers.
Where can those autonomous vehicles be obtained?
Well, there's various countries that are building these. The Swiss build them, the Russians build them, several other countries build them. They've been developed for humanitarian mine clearing operations over the last 20 or 30 years. What we need to do is scale up the production of these things, make them more networked, and have them work faster than what they used to. At the end of the day, not only do the Ukrainians need to clear minefields in combat, about 15% of Ukraine now has mines and unexploded ordnance. This is going to be a multi-decade effort to clear this both during and after the war.
On the subject of equipment, you also argue there needs to be a more standardised approach rather than the patchwork of weaponry each country provides. What do you foresee? What is the problem exactly?
Well, pretty much every army in the world chooses one standard main battle tank, one standard howitzer, one standard infantry fighting vehicle. Because if you're going to train lots of people on it, having one training system is far more efficient. It's the same thing with maintenance, with spare parts and these kind of things. If you're supporting one vehicle, it's cheaper and it's certainly more efficient. If you're supporting 5 or 6, you are spreading your efforts very thinly. You're having to train people in lots of different vehicles, both to use and to maintain. So at some point, we're going to have to bite the bullet and start providing single equipment sets of some of these key equipments like tanks and infantry fighting vehicles. That will need us to change our industrial production output.
It does seem that there wasn't much of a coordinated approach and everybody just scrambled to provide what they could. Was that the right thing to do at the time?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, we had no choice but to use what was in our inventories. After the Cold War, there was a lot of consolidation in defence industry, and that remains was producing much smaller amounts of equipment. So the response by NATO and these Ramstein meetings that meet very, very regularly to coordinate the provision of military aid was exactly right. But at the same time, we need to be thinking about the medium and long term. We can't keep drawing from inventories. They're much, much reduced compared to 2 years ago. And we do need to get into a standard set of equipment that works for the Ukrainians in the kind of operations that they're likely to conduct now and into the future.
Western-trained Ukrainian brigades have been deployed since about June. What impact do you think they are making?
Well, I think there's been a wide variety of performance outcomes from a lot of these brigades. The more experienced brigades who have been together for a long time, that have developed cohesion, who have good leaders, who are experienced, have probably been more successful in this offensive than the newer brigades, which just didn't have time to train their soldiers on new equipment and then do the collective training with larger and larger groups of soldiers before the offensive. Now, the Ukrainians tried to buy as much time as possible to do that, but at the end of the day, building combined arms teams in these new brigades takes a long time. It takes a long time for professional soldiers. And I think that we'll see some additional developments in training combined arms teams that will emerge from this offensive.
You mentioned earlier about how the tactics for minefields, for example, are completely out of date when you apply them to the war in Ukraine. How do you think NATO needs to adapt its military doctrine now?
Well, I would hope that NATO's thinking about some kind of Manhattan Project equivalent to be able to do this for the 21st century. Clearly, what we're doing now, what we think we might do in the future, is just not going to work. I mean, unfortunately for the Ukrainians, they've been kind of a mega battle lab on modern tactics, modern technologies, modern organisations, and we're seeing in real time what works and what doesn't during war under modern conditions. Now, unfortunately, most Western militaries have a very small, if non-existent footprint in Ukraine and aren't able to learn these lessons firsthand. There's a lot of vicarious learning, but I think we really need to have more people in there that are learning directly from the Ukrainians, developing solutions off-site and bringing them back, but also developing solutions for our own armies for the future.
Could you just explain a little bit more to our audience about the Manhattan-style project?
Well, the Manhattan Project was a mega project during the Second World War to develop the atomic bomb. Really what that means is it's a metaphor for really concentrating a lot of resources very quickly on solving a big problem. And I think that big problem really is the detection, the clearance of minefields in combat, and then moving through them to seize terrain from the enemy.
We were talking earlier about the tactics that are being used on the front line in the counter-offensive in terms of the positioning of the troops. And that did come in for some criticism in reports in Germany saying they were spreading them too thin. But it does look now, when you look at the repositioning of the VDV, the Russian VDV forces towards Tokmak, that this is actually causing concern with the Russian forces.
I think it's caused them concern for some time. The Ukrainians have done this very deliberately for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it puts the Russian commanders in a dilemma. I mean, where are the Ukrainians really going to focus most of their effort to try and get a breakthrough? So that's important. That means the Russians have to spread their forces much more thinly than they would like to. But secondly, it's this survivability issue. Where you have large concentrations of troops, the Russians are going to concentrate their artillery and rockets. So there's putting the enemy in a dilemma, and there's also ensuring the survivability of your own troops with that strategy.
We were talking earlier about the use of the combined tactics on the front line, and the fact that the Ukrainian forces, don't have air superiority. Do you think there is a role for drones there to plug the gap? Can that be effective in any way?
Well, there's some role. I mean, drones aren't at the stage yet of being able to deliberately and systemically attack fighter craft or attack helicopters. We're not at that point yet. But certainly more ground-based air defence would have been useful. But there's just some problems at the moment there aren't solutions for. You know, the Russians have long-range glide bombs that are launched from aircraft well outside Ukrainian airspace. They're just not able to attack. Having AMRAAMs missiles, which have just been provided, will certainly help with that. But having modern fighter jets with long-range radars and weapons will provide another layer to help the Ukrainians both on the battlefield and beyond.
With winter approaching, how long do you think Ukrainian forces can continue to fight?
Well, it really depends on a couple of things. It depends on how quickly they go through their reserves, and they're doing that, but so are the Russians. So there's a race to preserve soldiers until their enemy culminates or can't conduct further offensive operations. So they're both trying to do that to each other. And it also depends on munitions, particularly artillery and precision munitions. So that will drive both the tempo of operations and how long they can continue them. And then, of course, the third factor is weather. The predictions for winter this year are for a winter that's very similar to last year. And that means it won't be a very, very cold winter, but it certainly means there'll be lots of rain in the latter stages of this year and the early stages of next year. And once those rains start, it will certainly slow down operations for both sides.
President Putin has local elections in less than a week. There is still pressure not to mobilise. Does he have the troops needed to make it through the winter?
I think so, because even though he did the large partial mobilisation in the latter stages of 2022, they've actually maintained a mobilisation drumbeat of about 20 to 30,000 troops per month anyway. So he has enough to sustain his operations. He has enough to defend most of the ground that he has already. And at the end of the day, his strategy isn't so much to take over Ukraine in the next year, but it's just to make sure he doesn't lose and to play for time while Western supporters of Ukraine lose patience. That's his strategy and that's his theory of victory at the moment.
And you believe, though, that both sides have the resources and the will for an extended war. Do you think Western allies will feel the same?
Well, I'd like to hope so. I mean, we kept our forces in Afghanistan for over 20 years, and the United States was spending more each year in Afghanistan than it spent for the entirety of the Ukraine war. And by the way, we had boots on the ground. We were losing soldiers there all the time. So, this is not a war that I hope Western populations are getting weary of because they're not really being asked to do anything to support the Ukrainians other than a few cents of their tax dollars each day to help support the Ukrainians. As the Ukrainians said, we don't need your people, just provide us with the weapons and we can fight and win this war.
In your role as a Junk Fellow at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, DC, what kind of sense are you getting with the presidential elections approaching of the mood and the attitude towards the war in Ukraine in the US?
Well, certainly the polls indicate there is a majority of Americans who support the military assistance and intelligence and economic aid that's being provided, but that is declining. I mean, it's certainly not near the highs of what we saw a year ago, even though there is still a majority. And there is, there's a core of people that believe America should actually not be supporting Ukraine. There's a variety of reasons for that. Some noble, where they want the US just to focus on China, and some, as we know, probably are not so noble. It's going to be a difficult year in 2024. I think Ukraine understands that and is doing a lot to ensure that it can retain American support over the next 12 months.
And do you think that that can be achieved? Are you confident that the American support will remain?
Well, I think that's why the perception of success in this campaign is very important for Ukraine. They don't just have to be successful. People, citizens and populations in the countries that are supporting them need to believe they've been successful. So, they have to be good on the battlefield, but they also have to be good with diplomacy and good in the information warfare that's ongoing around the world.
You have also been analysing the way China is looking at this war and what it's learning from it. What will it be doing with that information?
Well, China has spent the last 30 years studying Western ways of warfare. It studied the 1991 Gulf War very, very closely. Indeed, it had a massive shock. It understood that having masses of army soldiers that were poorly armed was not the pathway to success in modern war. And this massive peacetime military build-up we've seen really started around that time. I think the Chinese will be undertaking a similar deep study of the lessons from this war, particularly with the use of autonomous systems, the use of sensors to make the battlefield more transparent, and the application of strategic information warfare and influence operations. These are the kind of things I think the Chinese will be studying, and I expect that they'll be evolving their force structure and their tactics because of this.
Mick Ryan, it's been really good to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time. You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.